Right, back with you now here on the Newsfeed Late Night, and your reporting continues. Following its United States Phase 3 efficacy trial, AstraZeneca says its COVID-19 vaccine is 80% effective at preventing the disease in the elderly and does not increase the risk of blood clots. Professor of Vaccinology at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Shabi Mahdi, joins us now to talk about this a little bit further. Prof, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. So this particular trial conducted to well over 32,000 people in the U.S., Chile and Peru. Are these findings consistent with what you have been thinking around the AstraZeneca vaccine? In fact, they're saying nobody who received the jab developed severe COVID-19 or died from it. Does this make it 100% protective?
So good evening to you. So it certainly makes it 100% protective against severe forms of the disease, which is really what we need to be focusing on, especially when there's a shortage in terms of vaccine supply. It's all about saving lives in the immediate future. But in addition to that, as you pointed out, the overall efficacy against all severity illness, which includes mild and moderate infection, was roughly about 79% for the entire population that was evaluated, and about 80% for people above the age of 65. So these findings are very consistent with earlier results from the United Kingdom as well as Brazil, where similarly they showed that the vaccine efficacy against all severity illness was in a region of 70 to 90%, and that there was 100% protection against severe disease.
Yeah. How different is this study or this trial phase compared to the one that we did here in South Africa in terms of size, but in terms of the processes that were followed?
Sure. So the study that was done in South Africa was at an early stage of development of the vaccine. It is what is referred to commonly as a phase 2 trial, where we only evaluated a limited number of participants, about 2,000. And the main purpose of that study was really to see if there was a signal for efficacy against all severity illness. And inadvertently, what ended up happening in the study was two major issues. The one is that we enrolled a relatively young age group demographic, amongst whom there was no cases of severe COVID-19. And secondly, what ended up happening is that inadvertently, we ended up having the virus evolved in South Africa to the extent where it became resistant to the antibody that was being induced by the vaccine. So consequently, what we showed in South Africa is that this particular vaccine did not protect against mild infection due to the virus that had evolved in South Africa. But the WHO, after reviewing the South African data together with other data points, concluded that even in countries where the B.1.351 variant does circulate, those countries should still continue pursuing use of the AstraZeneca vaccine because there's a strong biological likelihood that the vaccine would still protect against severe forms of disease.
Now, the fact that, other experts are saying, well, this particular results have not yet been published, so they're a little bit circumspect in commenting on them. And does that have any bearing on this outcome, the fact that they will be published at a later stage in the year?
Yeah, and I think they'll be published probably in the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. I don't think that would have any bearing in terms of the results. The results are not going to change. Companies take a huge amount of responsibility when they release these sort of results. So it's not just done on the fly. It's done after other interrogation of the data, because that is expectations from regulatory authorities that companies have actually checked all the boxes in terms of the validity of the data before sharing it in a public domain. So these results are not going to change, and when we see the results in 2 or 3 weeks probably in a publication, the results will remain pretty much the same.
Is this good news for South Africa? I mean, if indeed this vaccine is as effective as it says it is?
Well, like I said, we don't really know what the vaccine effectiveness is going to be against the B.1.351 variant. And in all likelihood, this vaccine, as well as every other vaccine, is going to have diminished effectiveness against the B.1.351 variant, at least for mild and moderate infection. However, irrespective of which vaccine you look at, in all likelihood, all of the vaccines, including the AstraZeneca vaccine, is highly likely going to protect against severe disease, even due to the B.1.351 variant, because the mechanism that this vaccine works to protect against severe disease is probably different from the mechanism the vaccine uses to protect against mild infection. So is it good news for South Africa? Unfortunately not, because in the wisdom of government and whoever advises government, they decided to take the 1 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine and sell it off to the African Union. And in return, what they decided to do is to procure 20 million doses of Pfizer vaccine, which we also don't know how well it will work against the B.1.351 variant. So it's somewhat paradoxical that on the one hand that we had 1 million doses of vaccine, but we were happy to pass it on to someone else to use, probably in Africa where the B.1.351 variant does circulate. And in return, we basically going to purchase 20 million doses of Pfizer vaccine, which we don't know how it's going to work against mild to moderate infection due to the B.1.351 variant. Both of these vaccines will probably perform equally well against a severe disease. So we need to be clear, even the Pfizer vaccine has not been evaluated against the B.1.351 strain in terms of clinical effectiveness.
Now let's talk then about the suspicions that have been doing the rounds of this vaccine being related to blood clotting. I mean, where does that come from? And what was your understanding of what that debate was about?
Right. So the concerns came mainly from Europe, where they observed a temporal association between when people were receiving the vaccine and individuals reporting what you refer to as blood clots. But when they investigated those blood clots, the rate or the incidence of those blood clots after people were vaccinated, what they demonstrated is that incidence was no different compared to the incidence that one would observe in a general population of unvaccinated individuals. In addition to which, in a study in an analysis in Finland, what they showed is that the frequency of that event of blood clots in a 30-day period after vaccination was no different compared to the frequency of those blood clots in a 30 to 60-day period before vaccination in the same individuals. So all of the data now points that the blood clots are unlikely to be related to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, they showed a similar frequency in terms of these blood clots in individuals that received the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine. Yeah. So the phase 3 trial, this large study of 32,000, didn't show, and these are the sort of pivotal trials, which looks at safety and is able to evaluate for safety much more robustly. They didn't show any difference between a vaccinated group and a control group in the frequency of these blood clots.
Now, there are some experts who are saying in the UK, for example, the advice is that if bruising should occur beyond where the jab has been administered, that would be a cause for one to seek medical attention because that could possibly lead to blood clotting.
Sure. So bruising is sort of a sign that there might be something happening in the blood, including a component of the blood known as platelets. And that is a further investigation that is currently taking place in the United Kingdom to determine whether individuals that are vaccinated, whether there might be a drop in the platelet count. These platelets are important in terms of ensuring that when there is a bleed, the bleed is stopped as quickly as possible. So that is something that, again, is being investigated. But even if there is an association between the vaccine possibly lowering the platelets, what really is important is about saving lives. And then it's a risk-benefit evaluation. It's the benefits of vaccinating people, preventing people from being hospitalized and dying, as opposed to developing these complications, which are not necessarily fatal. So I think what we need to appreciate is that we are dealing with some level of uncertainty. But what's important is really to look at everything from the perspective of a benefit to risk ratio when making a decision as to how to move forward.
Yeah. Now, the Dean of Brown University School of Public Health says this is our best ticket towards vaccinating the world. Do you agree with that? Would you share that sentiment?
Absolutely, and I'm not too sure whether he was referring to the AstraZeneca vaccine.
But the reality for
AstraZeneca, right. So the reality for the AstraZeneca vaccine is multifold. Firstly, is that it's a vaccine that is going to be most available. They expect to be able to produce 3 billion doses by the end of 2021. And the reason for that is AstraZeneca as a company has agreed to outsource its production to multiple other companies, including in middle-income countries such as India. And they basically providing this vaccine at no profit, at least for the duration of the pandemic. So the large quantity coupled with the very cost-effective vaccine, or rather a vaccine that is not too costly, obviously lends itself to this vaccine being more available. In fact, when looking at a COVAX facility right now, the majority of the 14 million doses of vaccine that has been deployed onto the African continent, more than 95% of the vaccine is the AstraZeneca vaccine. So for most countries, the AstraZeneca vaccine, especially low and middle income countries, the AstraZeneca vaccine is going to be the one that is going to be most readily available.
Yeah. Well, considering the fact that the deputy president was saying they are having difficulty at this particular point in time securing vaccines, much to the point that the deadline of vaccinating 1 million people by the end of March has been moved to somewhere in the middle of April. I mean, is this something that they should be looking at and considering?
Well, as you know, the South Africa's government decided to sell the 1 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine that it had in its storage room for the past month. They've decided to sell it on to the AU, which unfortunately I think is a completely misguided sort of strategy, because the worst case scenario was that this vaccine might not necessarily protect against severe infection due to the B.1.351 variant. But at least it would have provided some sort of a fighting opportunity, at least for those individuals that are at high risk of being hospitalized and dying from COVID-19 to be vaccinated before the next resurgence is upon us. And all indications from 6 out of the 9 provinces is that the third wave might very well have already started.
Hi, Professor, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us today. Professor of Vaccinology at Wits University, Professor Shabir Mahdi. This follows, of course, results coming from the U.S. showing that their trial of the AstraZeneca vaccine has proven to be very successful in preventing severe illness in 100% of the 32,000 that were tested on it. But it also shows 79% efficacy in those who are above the age of 65.